Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Could I just disturb you there? We should keep things rolling, but you keep eating and enjoying yourselves. I'd like to introduce our speaker, Zoe, to you. Before I do so, Kerry foreshadowed... Zora, sorry. Kerry foreshadowed earlier that we have another guest at our table, Michael Zaros, and she might have raised some expectations in your mind, so... So, I'll just give you a little taste of why Michael is here. Michael is a very renowned sculptor in Melbourne who does bronzes. There are many famous bronzes around Melbourne which we all admire, but probably don't know who did them. And Michael has no doubt done many of them. A very generous benefactor to the graduate house has offered to provide a sculpture which would recognise John Monash. That design has not yet gone to the Graduate Council, but nevertheless he's working on getting a very good design ready for us to consider. In parallel with that, the benefactor has also offered to fund a bronze plaque which would recognise the bequest of Dr. Philip Law. You might remember Dr. Philip Law left us $500,000 in shares and securities last year. Shares and securities had been cashed in, but it had been worth about $620,000. So we've been, and the condition on that bequest was that it be used for buildings of the graduate union. So that's what we've been doing, and you can see the new toilets outside, and not quite so obvious, but we put a lot of air conditioning into the terrace houses and made all electrical wiring up to modern standards and safe. So it's been put to good use. So the benefactor has also offered to fund this plaque to recognise Dr. Philip Law. And over on the table there is the drawing designs which we will make available to view on the night of the AGM. So don't anyone go rushing across there and have a look at them right now, because that will upset me. So, but that's why Michael's here. We're very fortunate to have him here at lunch with us today, so thank you, Michael. So to introduce our speaker this afternoon, Zora graduated from the University of Melbourne with a Bachelor of Arts in 2009, and during her undergraduate years at university she had a philosophy that it's the extra things that you do that make a difference in the long run. That is, she would, for example, I believe, told her younger brother, who was studying at the university at the time, that you've got to join everything. And I guess some of us have done that. It was this attitude that led Zoe to work at the student union newspaper Farrago, which Melbourne University graduates could be familiar with. Farrago was probably an internship for Zoe, because she assisted her in gaining her current role as the deputy editor of the quarterly literary journal, Miajin, which is based here at the university. So I imagine that for you, that you're finding authors to publish and putting together a whole edition would be, particularly something that you're passionate about, would be give you a great sense of achievement, and achieving it on time in all areas is very highly satisfying. So today we're fortunate to not only have a publisher, but also a writer and someone who enjoys telling a story. So I think that's probably going to be where we are entertained and informed today. So please give Zora a very pleasant Graduate House welcome.
Thank you very much, David. Now, I have had a bit of a cold, so I do apologise if I'm a little nasal, if I sneeze loudly into the microphone at any point. You might have to cover your ears. I'm sorry about that. First of all, thank you very much for having me here today. It's lovely. I have to say I've never been into Graduate House before, but it's been a lovely, warm introduction, so thank you very much for that. So the topic that I chose many months ago and sort of then forgot about was talking about the things that I wanted to do that I haven't ended up doing, but perhaps that's for the best, which is a fairly vague and confusing topic, so I hope you'll bear with me. The first thing I remember wanting to be was an astronaut. I wish I could remember what initially attracted me to the idea, but I suspect that, like many others, it was an image captured by the Hubble Space Telescope that planted the seed of my ambition. These days, those strange and glorious images of far distant clouds of matter, brightly coloured and internally illuminated by clusters of newborn stars, are almost passé. A million desktop backgrounds and posters tacked to bedroom walls, a testament to their ubiquity. But still, I defy anyone upon seeing them for the first time not to feel a moment of wonder, not to experience that terrifying sensation of grasping, if only for a split second, the true measure of our own insignificance and transience. Our brains are not very good at comprehending the universe, the scale and distances involved, the time spans and complexity are concepts we can only sidle up to and glance at out of the corner of our eye, not look directly at lest we're blinded. I remember seeing those images from Hubble in a book of magic eye puzzles. And while I still can't to this day solve a magic eye puzzle, I do still feel that sense of wonder. I told my parents I wanted to be an astronaut. I told my teachers and friends. Someone made the mistake of telling me about Space Camp, the place that American space-obsessed children spend their summers learning to walk in zero gravity and survive the massive G-forces involved in spaceflight and eating nothing but dehydrated ice cream for 3 months straight, or so I imagined. The galling thing for me was that Space Camp is held in Huntsville, Alabama, just 50 minutes drive from the town of Coleman, Alabama, which happens to be where my mother grew up and where my grandmother still lived throughout my childhood. I had been to Huntsville. I could have spent my holidays on the fast track to becoming the first Australian woman in space, rather than cooped up in my grandmother's mildewy basement playing board games with half the pieces missing. As far as I was concerned, once you'd attended Space Camp, you were more or less a qualified astronaut, and NASA would be begging you to man a mission to Mars, or at least the International Space Station. And if not NASA, the Russians would be keen to poach a Space Camp qualified astronaut for their own program, and would be grateful for the knowledge and expertise such a person would surely bring. My interest in space was always focused on the explorative rather than the scientific. I wanted to go there, to see Earth from space and feel the strangeness of that, to live in zero gravity, to walk on the surface of moons and planets, to experience something beyond mere foreignness. I wanted to know what it was like to be somewhere truly alien. The idea that I could go to a place where the very earth beneath my feet would not in fact be Earth at all fascinated me. My desire to be an astronaut was then the ultimate pursuit of novelty. But the more I learned about what astronautics actually entailed, the more I realised how little suited to it I was. The fact that astronauts are scientists and mathematicians who happen to work in space was something that had entirely escaped me. At this point, I was still trying unsuccessfully to memorise my 6 times tables, and my teachers and parents were desperately trying to make me understand terrifying and obtuse concepts like long division. It seemed my mind just couldn't speak. It seemed my mind just couldn't speak the language of numbers, couldn't fix them in my head in any meaningful structure or pattern. In grade 3, at the peak of my astronautic ambitions, I was almost expelled from the classroom by an exasperated, infuriated teacher for refusing point blank to accept that 1 times 1 could possibly equal anything other than 2. Clearly, the deep knowledge of mathematics upon which all sciences rely was well beyond me. That, in combination with my legendary motion sickness, I still sometimes get nauseous if I turn on my swivel chair too quickly, seemed to preclude me from ever realising my dream of seeing the Earth from far above, from seeing it at such a great distance, in fact, that above is no longer a sensible descriptor. By age 8, I had abandoned my ambition to be an astronaut in favour of more terrestrial pursuits. In fact, my next ambition was quite literally terrestrial. I wanted to be an archaeological Egyptologist. Obsessions with space in ancient Egypt are not especially unusual in children, of course. The kind of child who has a mobile of the solar system and an excavate your own sarcophagus kit is also the kind of child who can and will tell you why Pachycephalosaurus is their favourite dinosaur, and whose Lego constructions actually match the photograph on the lid. I was that kind of kid, except without the patience or attention to detail. I would start projects full of enthusiasm, only to abandon them within the hour. Once for my birthday, my poor father gave me 3 model aeroplane kits of World War II fighters. I patiently opened each box and spent an hour popping out every tiny plastic component from each kit, at which point I actually opened one of the instruction booklets and saw page after page of confusing, complicated directions. I immediately abandoned the project and threw all 3 piles of parts into one box, thrust them to the back of my closet to languish in a sullen confusion of Lancaster, Hurricane and Spitfire. I never got another model aeroplane kit as a present. The attraction of Egyptology was then less about painstaking detective work and intensive research than the showy appeal of great monuments and vengeful gods. On a trip to New York when I was 9, we visited the Metropolitan Museum of Art and wandered around the Temple of Dendur, a strange piece of ancient Egypt relocated to the Upper East Side of Manhattan. The entire temple was moved to save it from being lost beneath the waters of the Aswai High Dam in 1963 and presented to Jacqueline Kennedy in 1965. Which is an interesting gift, I have to say. Now it sits seemingly a little confused and lonely in the Sackler wing of the Met, while the upper crust of New York society hold parties and benefits nominally in its honour. Those beautifully carved stones with their patterns of lotus plants and papyrus, occasionally obscured by graffiti from 19th century English sailors, were testament to the ability of objects to last and to carry messages through time and between civilizations. We cannot speak to the people who built those stones, but we can see the things they created, the things they cared about, the remnants of the world they inhabited. My 9-year-old self stood beneath the temple gate and looked up at the warm yellow sandstone above my head and considered all the people who had looked up and seen the same sight before me. All the people who had stood exactly where I did and thought the same thoughts in 100 languages, in 100 different ages. All the people who had marvelled at the ingenuity of the architects, the strength of the labourers and the skill of the stonemasons. All the way back to those very architects, labourers and stonemasons themselves, who sweated under the same sun that now streamed in through the massive windows of the Sackler wing, causing eddies of reflected light to bounce off the shallow pools of water that surrounded the temple in its new home, a strange and pale imitation of the sparkling Nile. That for me was magical. That was time travel. We walked around the Met's enormous collection of Egyptian art and artefacts, and I became more and more certain that these were the objects I wanted to study, and these were the people I wanted to understand. Back home in Australia, I began the process of alerting those around me to my new chosen career. Did they know that the Egyptians removed a person's brain after death by scraping it out with hooks through the nose? Did they know about the lion-headed goddess Sekhmet, whose fiercely hot breath created the Egyptian desert? Or that the mummy of Ramesses II had to be flown to Paris in 1974 for preservation, at which time he was issued with his own passport that listed his occupation as king, brackets deceased. I learned to write my name, probably deeply inaccurately, in hieroglyphics, and I wore my souvenir Egyptian hippopotamus necklace everywhere I went. But again, as my knowledge of ancient Egypt increased, my certainty that Egyptology was the career path for me decreased. The first issue was that Egypt was hot, really hot and dry and dusty. My delicate eczema and sunburn-prone skin found 3 months of Australian summer almost more than it could bear. How would it survive the months, even years, that an Egyptian archaeological dig would require? But even more than my physical unsuitability for Egyptian climes, my enthusiasm was gradually dampened by the suspicion, fairly well grounded in reality, that 2,000 years of dedicated, organised, even state-sanctioned looting had robbed the Egyptian deserts of their treasures. If Herodotus had heard tales of the great treasures that had been stolen from the pyramids of Giza in the 5th century, what chance did I have of finding an undiscovered tomb some 6 centuries later There is still a lot we don't know about the ancient Egyptians, but the new discoveries seem to me to be about grunt work, dull research, scientific experimentation. I wasn't interested. The days of Howard Carter peering into a dark hole in the sand to see the glittering face of King Tutankhamun peering back seemed long over. The death of my Egyptological ambitions coincided with my family's move to the UK when I was 11. Had we remained in Australia, I suspect all my interest in archaeology might have died too. But instead I merely transferred my interest in what lay beneath the ground from the sands of Egypt to the immediate surrounds of my English hometown. We moved to the cathedral city of Salisbury, which was then home to ex-Prime Minister Sir Edward Heath, what may be the finest cathedral in Europe, and what certainly is the greatest museum any 11-year-old child ever had the great fortune to visit. The Salisbury Museum of my childhood was exactly what museums are supposed to be. For one thing, it was actually full of stuff. There was room after room of dusty cabinets holding everything from an 11th century version of a Swiss pocket knife to a mummified rat found inside the skull of a knight who had been entombed in the neighbouring cathedral. The best thing about the rat, besides the fact that it was a mummified rat discovered inside the skull of a medieval knight, was that tests had revealed that the rat had died from arsenic poisoning, presumably immediately after consuming portions of the decomposing knight's brain, which certainly raised some interesting questions about how the knight died. Also inside the museum was the costume gallery, where row upon row of mismatched mannequins modelled everything from the scraps of 16th century lace collars to mud-stained World War I infantry uniforms. The museum itself was housed in a 13th century manor, studded with fine Wiltshire flint, that had been known as the King's House ever since King James I was entertained there in 1610. The building even has a cameo in Jude the Obscure. But the best thing about the museum, at least in my opinion, was that it was home to the South Wiltshire Young Archaeologist Club, which I joined immediately upon our arrival in the town. The Young Archaeologist Club was a haven for history-loving, bookish and thoughtful children, or as they are more commonly known, nerds. At meetings we built miniature rafts to learn about how the mighty sarsen stones at Stonehenge were transported from the Preseli Hills in modern-day Wales. We practiced archery in the museum's grassy courtyard and learned how to tell bricks laid in Flemish bond from British bond, and thus date a building's construction and identify later additions. But the most exciting thing about the Young Archaeologist Club were the occasional excursions to real digs in the Wiltshire countryside. One warm July day, we drove to Avebury. Now, although Stonehenge is the most famous and spectacular of Britain's stone circles and lies just 8 miles from Salisbury, Avebury is the biggest. So big, in fact, that the village of Avebury sits within the circle, perhaps growing up from the settlements of people seeking whatever protection the circle might have offered from enemies, plagues and animals that stalked the gentle chalk hills in a wilder era. We had come to witness the excavation of a newly discovered avenue of sarsen stones that had once led southwards from Avebury towards the Beckhampton Long Barrow, where Neolithic Britons spent decades constructing mounds of earth to honour their dead kings, and then spent the subsequent decades and centuries quietly forgetting about them. The avenue of stones we'd come to see excavated had been gradually lost over the centuries as they toppled and were buried, or deliberately broken up by superstitious locals in the 12th century. Our group of about 20 8 to 15-year-olds gathered around a large trench that had been dug to expose one of the fallen stones. Who knew what other artefacts might lie buried beneath the fields of ripe yellow wheat around us? Visions of the great Sutton Hoo treasure, of kings laid to rest in ancient ships buried under man-made hills, of blank-eyed bronze masks covered in jewels, great oaken shields studded with iron and gold buckles and finely wrought images of lions and dragons filled my head. Unfortunately, as we looked down into the trench, it was hard to avoid the fact that what was actually being excavated before us was, in essence, a big rock. An interesting rock, certainly, a rock redolent with ancient meaning and steeped in lost ritual, assuredly, but also just an enormous rock. On the drive over, we'd been told that there had long been an Avebury legend which said that during the 12th century, the villagers became suspicious of the stones and came to believe they'd been erected by the devil himself. In a fit of religious fervour, they decided to tear down the stones, but the first one they attacked with shovels and picks fell unexpectedly, crushing a man beneath it. The villagers then found that the stone was too heavy to move, so they left the man's body beneath the mighty stone. The best part of the story, for we amateur archaeologists, was that in 1938, a dig had indeed discovered the remains of a man crushed beneath one of the largest stones, which weighed a good 13 tons. He carried with him a purse containing coins that dated from 1320 to 1325, as well as a pair of iron scissors and a lance, suggesting that the man was a travelling barber surgeon who just happened to be passing through the village of Avebury at the time. This story had raised all our hopes, and when at the dig site someone in the club haltingly asked one of the archaeologists working in the trench whether they'd happened to find any crushed bodies yet, we all leaned forward in eager anticipation of their reply. The archaeologist answered that no, of course they hadn't found any crushed bodies. She seemed distinctly irritated by our presence, as if the stone might sneakily run off through the fields if she turned her back for too long to answer silly questions from kids. We were all disappointed. I gathered my resolve and asked whether they'd at least found some treasure, like from Sutton Hoo. She coldly replied that Sutton Hoo was a 7th century burial, and gave me a look as if I'd asked whether they'd perhaps found any pieces of the True Cross down in the trench. It wasn't just our archaeologists who seemed to put out. Everyone on the dig looked tired, bored and irritated, which, considering the fact that they'd spent weeks digging up a massive hunk of rock without discovering a single man-made find, was probably understandable. Yet again, I experienced the dawning realisation that my gilded impression of what an archaeologist did, even in a country as full of buried treasure as England, was fairly far from reality. These people clearly spent most of their time squatting in holes, finding nothing. That wasn't what archaeology was supposed to be about. It seems obvious to me now what the problem was. In every instance, what initially attracted me to these jobs was that they were all engaged in grand narratives that told stories on a superhuman scale. Space is the longest story we will ever be told. It is the absolute beginning and the absolute end of all other, lesser stories. The Egyptians were a people who believed in immortality of the spirit in the afterlife, of the body through mummification, and of their power through great monuments. But ultimately, their greatest claim to immortality is that they created a culture that still speaks to us, that still captures the imagination of 9-year-old children everywhere, and probably will for as long as the gruesome details of the mummification process are retold to them. Archaeology has the power to give us facts around which we weave the stories of the past. But it was only as an adult that I realised that what I loved about archaeology was not the beautiful, mysterious or mundane objects themselves, but the long-forgotten lives that they belong to. Every shard of pottery that has ever been taken out of the ground was moulded in the palm of a human who once lived and thought and felt and breathed and knew nothing of us, but hoped that somehow something of their life might be remembered after they were gone. This is the gift archaeology gives. It grants our ancestors a sliver of immortality, and it grants us the hope that we might receive our own sliver in some not too distant to imagine age, when another group of children might gather around a trench in a field and witness the discovery of an object we made or touched or loved. I've ended up, at least so far, working with words and stories, and I know that that is what I was trying to get at through all my childhood ambitions. By my desk today are cupboards full of every edition of Meanjin since the first fragile slim volume from December in 1940. Inside are stories and arguments and passions. They speak of the smallest concerns and the grandest themes. They speak of people who cared enough to write. What I do now, apart from all the filing and answering emails and arguing with poets, is take news stories and put them into an object, one that won't probably last 1,000 or more years, but may at least last longer than I do, and longer than the people who've written. And that is the kind of immortality I've always been interested in. I don't know what jobs I might do in my lifetime. Perhaps I'll always work with words and stories. Perhaps I'll forsake them entirely. Perhaps I'll one day figure out what the exactly perfect thing is that will satisfy my craving for those grand narratives. Perhaps one day I will even eventually get down in the dirt myself and start digging. Thank you.
Any questions of Zora? Questions?
I won't be offended if there's no questions.
Well, I'd like to ask you a question once. why do you have to get down to the earth and start digging? I mean, that's the last point that I've ever heard you say.
Well, I think I was probably taking a little bit of artistic license there. But I have to say, I still fantasize about, getting out in the field and using my hands to find objects and do that kind of work still appeals to me. And these days I don't get to do anything very much like that. I sit in a very safe, clean office and work on a computer most of the day. But getting down in the dirt has its appeal to me, I have to say.
All right. I'll hear someone on the side of the room. Question? Yes, Karen?
I'm interested, when you look at the stars, you see the galaxy, you're looking at ranging from 1940 to 2012. What do you see as sort of like the star or the galaxy of change in the writing style or the poet arguments or what do you see when you see the collective?
It's interesting because we've actually been putting together an anthology over the last 6 to 12 months of me engine, so it's involved a lot of reading old editions, and yeah, there's probably, to be honest, probably the things that stand out to you are not necessarily the positive things. There's a lot of you notice how the politics have changed in 70 odd years, and not many women writers in those early editions. A handful. I hope we're a little more balanced these days. But sometimes you pick something up and it's from someone, a name that didn't make it. There's lots of pieces from the big names, lots of Patrick Whites and Vance Palmers, but sometimes you get something from a name that you never heard of and probably no one else in the office has. It's just wonderful. It's just this small gem of its time, and this is the only place it still exists. This physical object is the only place, and hopefully, we do things like create anthologies to try and resurrect these small gems, but maybe they don't even need it. Maybe they just exist for the few who come across them like I do and get that small rush of pleasure. Yeah.
Questions? Yes, please, Anne.
Mine is not so much a question as a comment. I can relate absolutely to what you said. As a 9-year-old in my grandfather's house, where the only reading fit for a child was myths and legends from ancient Greek and Rome, and I subsequently went on to university and did archaeology and anthropology, and ended up teaching English and health education. What really appealed to me, and I haven't really crystallised the thought till you said it, was that these are the stories of people. And now I'm involved with looking into the archives of various things, and I thought that puts me in the middle of a chain. All these people who came before me, all these people are going to go after me, and I'm a bit of it. And I find that incredibly exhilarating. Thank you.
Thank you. That's exactly what I was getting at. Yeah.
Thank you, Anne.
Sorry. It's a wonderful story that you've told us, and you obviously have a real flair for storytelling. Do you see yourself going on and becoming, well, you might be already, and I don't know, an author in your own right, and continuing to tell the stories?
Yeah, this is probably a terrible thing to say, but most of my stories are about my mother, who's a great eccentric, and we all. Well, this is the thing. I've never yet met a person who didn't think their parents were eccentric. So, maybe, but I have to say she's very particular. So yeah, I have a lot of stories about her, and there's always that issue of when you're writing about real people, what do you do? And I'm fairly reluctant to, because I tend to take her stories and sort of build them up into something that she probably wouldn't think they really were. So I wonder if you have to wait till the person in question's passed away, or or seek their permission. But I mean, I love writing. I do find when you work with words all day every day, you can get a little bit of fatigue. So I often I go through long periods where I don't write much for myself. But one day, I'll sit down and put something on paper.
Look forward to it.
Thank you.
One last question over here.
Right, it's just a comment to say that don't leave it too late with your mother, because if she does pass away, you can't verify it with either of your siblings or anyone else.
That's true,
And
yeah.
I'll tell you something, everybody sees something differently.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
found that out in my own family, and it's sad.
Yeah.
Because you've lost it, then
Yeah.
you've lost the story.
Yeah, you're right. I won't wait too long, I promise.
One last question here, thank you.
Thanks. Look, I thoroughly enjoyed your story there and your mode of storytelling and your beautiful massaging of the words. I was just wondering whether you perhaps projected yourself a few years down the track whether you might think about teaching, because that's the sort of skill we should be instilling and instigating with our young people.
I didn't, look, if I'd gone through everything that I ever wanted to be, we'd be here till, dinner time. But teaching's definitely on there, and I still consider it. And I always, feel a little bit like, I walk along the kind of top of a hill, and down at the bottom is teaching, and I sort of slide a little more towards it as time goes on. And I did a gap year working in a school in the UK, a wonderful school which actually was Charles Dickens' house, and he left the house to be turned into a school. And it was a great year. I had a wonderful time that year, just sort of working with children from sort of 3 to 17, and it's something that I hold dear, the idea of going into teaching one day, not quite yet, but one day.
Oh yes, another question. Two questions.
Another comment, you don't have to commit to being a teacher, just volunteer at any school, any time, they will grab you.
Good advice.
Yes. One other comment on teaching, if you want to know the process of incremental insanity.
I'm also familiar with that side of it as well.
Thank you for those great questions and compliments to Zora. Zora, as I mentioned in my introduction, part storyteller and part many other skills. Well, the storyteller has really come through, as you've all acknowledged by your questions. Not only are you a talented storyteller, but you're also giving us concurrently a feeling for certain aspects of history, which have clearly taken your interest. I mean, I can relate to it because I also think to myself, I'd like to go back in time and be the personal assistant of Robert Hooke and Isaac Newton and Michael Faraday and a few of those sort of people. And it'd be great because I already know the answers too. But I agree, it's an interesting way of the mind, and to be able to illustrate your interest in certain subjects and archaeology and so on. So it's very clear that you have this talent, and as you gather by some of the questions, we recognise that you've got some way to go in your storytelling and conveying it to the wider audience. I guess we look forward to tracking your career. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your attending here today and giving us a great insight to storytelling and the talent of the young graduates of the University of Melbourne. Thank you. And here we have something very nice to decorate your office and impress your colleagues when you go back. I was hoping that we'd also have the customary Graduate House pen for you, because I had a story already in my mind to use for that, but I'll use it anyway. But I'm a few years older than you, and in my days, if you want to write a story, what did you? You got a piece of paper and a pen. And but nowadays, of course, things are different. We don't use the nice, simple technology of a pen, but we spend a fortune on a computer, a keyboard and screen, and all these sorts of clever things. So, whereas a pen sort of does such a great job. So we can't offer you the old technology, but I'm sure you're familiar with the current technology. But nevertheless, these flowers, they go on forever in terms of their symbolism and their beauty, but unfortunately they won't last that long, but we hope you'll appreciate that. So I think that winds it up, and you can enjoy yourselves and keep chatting to everyone, and maybe there's some more coffee if you want. I don't know. Have a good time.
I liked it.